This lecture continues the series on the Dutch Republic by turning now to perhaps the most famous painter from Holland, Rembrandt van Rijn, who would revolutionize painting specifically in the genres of portraiture and group portraiture. Now, Haarlem, where we left off with Frans Hals, was artistically supreme in the Dutch Republic until around 1640, when we have the rise of Amsterdam, currently the capital of Holland. It would be the largest and most prosperous city, and unlike its southern counterparts, would never be invaded or sacked by the Spanish. Instead, it would attract Jewish and Protestant immigrants from around Europe who were fleeing religious persecution and were being taxed and or otherwise punished because of their religious views. And given the tolerant nature of Amsterdam, just like today, the population would swell in the 17th century from 60,000 to over 100,000 people. The prosperous citizens here commissioned single and group portraits to record their deeds and their livelihood. The work here for painters and architects would explode with the building of townhomes for these wealthy merchants, the highest per capita in all of Europe, but without sculptural commissions, for the Dutch did not order tombs. And in fact, if you go to Amsterdam today and hunt down the tomb of Rembrandt and his son that we will discuss, who died in the plague, you will find a very modest whitewashed area that just says Rembrandt in a church. The innovations that we discussed in Haarlem would then be adopted here in Amsterdam as the capital for the art world in Holland would shift from Haarlem to this new area. The most important painter in Amsterdam between 1610 and 30, before the rise of Rembrandt, was Pieter Lastman. He traveled to Italy from 1601 to 02 and stayed there until 1606. Therefore, his Italianate influence will be felt by the early versions of Rembrandt's art. Now, Rembrandt studies with Lastman from 1623 to 24. Now, we know that Lastman, interestingly enough, only produced history paintings, which was a brave decision, for at the time most artists made their living on portraits. He was influenced by classical art, but primarily modeled his own art on Elsheimer, with the approach we see here with natural landscapes as backdrops to religious and history paintings. So in addition to that, we have richly costumed and crowded characters in Lastman's work, with vaguely Roman buildings. This will be adapted by Rembrandt around 1627 and 28. Here is an example of Lastman's work with Abraham dismissing Hagar and Ishmael, for he was not able to have a child of his own, and so it was decreed that he would impregnate his servant Hagar, who had a son, Ishmael, who after Sarah, his 90-year-old wife, became pregnant with Isaac, he was forced to send them away into the desert to die. And this is that moment where they cross paths and we see two different directions as they are cast out. The muscular thigh, though, here of Ishmael in the center who cries, torn between them, is a testament to the Italianate classicism appreciated by Lastman. Now, this is the teacher of Rembrandt, but now we must turn to the artist proper. Born in 1606 and then dying of the plague in 1669, Rembrandt van Rijn was born in Leiden to a miller. This was the city of the oldest Protestant university still in operation, and we know that Rembrandt was listed in its registry when he was 14. Therefore, he was a competent Latinist, or perhaps his parents intended a different career for him, like Rubens, say in law or letters. He studied first off with Jacob van Swanenburg from 1619 to 22 in Leiden, seen here, and then moved to Amsterdam in 1622 to 23, apprenticing then with Lastman. In his early work, here an example being Tobit and Anna from 1626, we can see what will set him apart from his contemporaries: a subtle reading of a scene with carefully described textural differentiation and psychological insight. These three characteristics will become the most important for Rembrandt. Now, he had more schooling than most other artists, which allowed him the ability to read text in a subtle fashion, and he would often choose unconventional points in a narrative. The example shown here from the Book of Tobit shows Anna, who brought her blind old husband Tobit a goat, whereby he accuses her of stealing it and insists that it must be returned to its rightful owner. She is quite upset and claims he is more generous to strangers than to her. Distraught by this claim, he then prays for death, as we see him doing here, a blind old man on the left, dropping his cane, praying to die, while his wife looks shocked holding this goat. Now, only Pieter Lasteman has actually depicted this scene before. It is very rare. More commonly, we would see the healing of Tobit's blindness, or him scolding his wife Anna. We see neither, a very unusual scene, but again relating to seeing the truth, seeing once again the light as reflected in the truth of God's word, which will be a running theme throughout Rembrandt's art. Therefore, as we noted, his strengths will be for the rest of his career this unusual narrative choice, the attention to textural differentiation, and that he is so attuned to the psychology of human interaction. Putting these three things together, and we have a nuanced approach to what he preferred to paint, which are history paintings. So what we have here are bright colors and well-lit interiors that by 1627 would begin to disappear in favor of a more monochromatic and tenebristic approach. Here we have the shock seen in Anna's eyes as she is going to be witnessing her husband praying for death, illustrating the interest in textural differentiation between the cloth that she wears, her wrinkled skin, and the fur of the goat, versus the psychological insight, which we see astonishment here, discussed later in the century by Charles Lebrun in his expression of the Passions. This more monochromatic palette and dramatic lighting effects coming from Caravagism is going to be seen in his self-portrait from 1629. So here we note that he is virtually obscured, looking down at us out of the corner of his eyes. Now this is going to be a time in which he seeks to differentiate himself from his master, Pieter Lasteman, who paints with very bright, very equally lit scenes that are going to be opportune for bright costumes. So this is much more akin to and attuned to the spontaneous technique of Frans Hals or Adrian Brouwer, whereby he actually turns his brush around with the hair to scrape away the darker outer layers to reveal the lightly painted underpainting here, as though the light is raking across his wavy hair. So just like we find with Brouwer's The Bitter Drink here, we have the immediacy captured, not the details entirely of his personage and his physiognomy. So the subtle attention paid to lighting effects, especially one in which we are in an interior space and light is going to, in a golden fashion, be radiating out, will be one of the hallmarks of his unified atmospheric effects moving forward, and especially notable in his group portraits. Now he moves to Amsterdam and comes to the attention of Constantine Huygens, who is the Stadthouder's secretary, the head of this particular region. Now we know that Huygens is going to visit Rembrandt in his studio with other young artists, and then comes back and states that they were know-it-alls and do not think it worth their while to sacrifice the few months that it would take them to visit Italy. Now, we find that Huygens is classically trained and believed that artists needed to study ancient and modern works to be equally as informed. Rembrandt retaliated by claiming that he could see Italian art in Amsterdam. However, his knowledge is actually quite limited, as many works have attested to in studies such as Rembrandt and Italy. Now, he launched his career as a portrait painter with three-quarter length portraits, akin to those that are popularized in Flanders. But there is a very important distinction with Rembrandt. Here with his Nicholas Rutz, we have a fur trader that works with Russia and trades with the Russians. We obviously want to foreground what he does for a living by showcasing these very lavish furs that he's wearing, as well as a fur hat. The pose of the figures, being three-quarter length, might at first remind us of those mercantile or middle-class portraits by Van Dyck, such as the portrait of an elderly man. However, later in the century here, if we look at Rembrandt's example, yes, he does lean on an elaborate chair with his right hand. With his left, he holds a note, foreshortened, coming out at us. But there is a distinction along with this monochromatic palette and dramatic lighting. We have the emphasis on textures, yes, but even furthermore, if you look at the pose of Nicholas versus Van Dyck's sitter, he turns more directly to us, handing us something. So we have more of a psychological engagement and insight. We are not distanced from them. He is not backing away from us, turning away from us and looking down at us. Instead, he turns very empathetically and once again unapologetically looking out, asking us to engage with him. After producing several of these three-quarter length portraits, Rembrandt would cement his reputation as the best portrait painter in Amsterdam with this group portrait, the Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tulp from 1632, which is signed and dated on the back wall behind one of the guild members. Now here we have many of these members gathered around the prelector for the Anatomy Guild, lecturing on the nerves of the hand with an anatomy text at the feet of this corpse. So we find that the group here is going to be united by way of chiaroscuro and this unified deep dark atmosphere. So the corpse seen here is actually Eris Kint. We know that this is a convicted thief who was executed a day earlier for stealing a coat, which might seem insignificant to us, but of course it gets very cold in the north, and this could lead to hypothermia and death. Now, this is the second public dissection of January 1632 of this particular anatomy guild. But importantly, we would normally begin by removing the viscera, the intestines and other organs in the gut to prevent rotting. And you would only perform dissections in the winter because they did not have refrigeration to keep the corpse cold. So we know that this would be very obvious to anyone associated with an anatomy guild and who had seen a dissection. For the very famous De Humani Corpus Fabrica of Andreas Vesalius shows on the very front that you always hollow out and take the viscera out first, just as you would after hunting a deer or, again, butchering an animal, because it would begin spoiling the meat in this way. So removing the intestines then would allow you time to go through the various organs and show future doctors, surgeons, and the like what to expect when performing surgery, or once again trying to save someone's life by suturing them, for instance. So the fact that we do not have the viscera removed and that we are starting on the arm, which would be the last part of the body we would actually dissect, is significant. And it would remind us that Dr. Tulp here holds up the tendons that move the thumb and the forefinger, our opposable thumb, in other words. And this is going to reinforce his argument that the opposable thumb, in fact, is proof of man's superior status to animals, and of course gives us the right to rule over animals and the world. Now, if we compare it to Frans Hals, we note that there is a difference both in temperament, finish, and atmosphere. So Frans Hals is going to have a lively and engaged scene where a group of these militiamen are going to be seeing off several of their members that fought at Breda, right? But the interactivity here is going to be more so with a dramatic chiaroscuro, bringing them together, not because they're all looking at one another or talking to one another. In fact, several of them, three in fact, look out at us. Others look intently at Dr. Tulp, while another looks down at the corpse and what he is presenting. So we actually have a unity in space and atmosphere rather than brushwork and attitude. So we find that Rembrandt, if you look at the figures, will have them blending into one another with the same tone, the same color and shadow, until they become one unit right here, which is very different than Frans Hals' approach, which is much more spontaneous and brings them together by way of this blurred rhythm that we have throughout the scene. Now that, of course, is going to be a genre of portrait. Of course, one of the most respected and lucrative types of genres. But here we see in a painting, a very small one, the artist in his studio from 1627 to 28. This very melancholic, sad artist in this lone room that is sparsely decorated with a monumental canvas, the size of which he has not worked on yet. For even though portraits make Rembrandt's reputation and provide him a steady income, he prefers the respect that history painting accords him and affords him because it is the hardest and most difficult genre to paint in, as believed by not only the Italians but the French Academy. So the scale that we have here is reserved for these grand narratives, and it was believed by other theorists and very important thinkers and individuals in Amsterdam that the Dutch were as significant painters as their Flemish counterparts in the south. Therefore, Huygens is going to see Rembrandt as Rubens' equal and needs to have them compare one another, compare their works. So he commissions to paint these panels for the Stadtholder, meant for connoisseurs to compare the two artists, one Flemish and one Dutch. Now we know that Rembrandt never saw the massive heroic 15 feet wide triptychs, but he did know of them through engravings, but not the coloration. In the engravings, we find they are reversed, and this is what Rembrandt is working from and explains why his version of Christ in each example is the opposite and the mirrored image of Rubens. So here we have the raising of the cross, which is only 3 feet high, and the descent from the cross, which is the same height. Now here we reverse each one of the positions, but instead of the dramatic, brightly lit heroism and classical heroic musculature of Rubens, we have a quiet, much more contemplative approach, for he cannot compete with the scale of Rubens. Now we know that he shows himself as Longinus at the feet of the cross, dressed in contemporary attire with a beret and a striped blue and white shirt. And he then shows himself as the self-portrait, lowering Christ off the cross, perhaps now understanding he has been converted, for instance. So if we compare the elevation of the cross and the raising of the cross between Rubens and then Rembrandt's later version, we see that it does not attempt the same heroic dynamism. Christ is not incredibly muscular, and we see exactly where the cross is being raised into position. There is no interactivity or ambiguity, and it seems to take place at night as we see these figures dressed in quasi-exotic attire with turbans on their heads directing what's happening here. So the scale is going to limit what he is able to do, for he cannot show the same type of drama and dynamism. So he purposefully avoids heroism in this example to make a very poignant counterpart and a counterpoint to Rubens. So here we have the descent from the cross, and likewise we do not have the heroic body of Christ, but instead are asked to confront the reality of the broken corpse, for it is not heroic in this way. And if we show you a detail, it does look like a broken sack of potatoes, it's been discussed, where his bones seem to be fractured and limp and frayed, where his head and neck are limply falling over his chest, which then collapses his ribs into his side, pulling his hip up to nearly his head. So this shows the physicality of death that we are asked to confront, not to consider the heroic death of Rubens' example in the descent from the cross. Now we have, with the blinding of Samson, an example that also is meant to compete with that of Rubens. This is a massive painting. It's 6 feet tall, 9 feet wide. We have life-size, monumental figures showing the moment that the strongest man in the Old Testament is blinded, being betrayed by Delilah, who runs out of this tent, whereby she is holding shears and the hair of Samson, showing how this deed was done. So this is the largest work to date for Rembrandt, and it would remind anyone at the time of another work of a very powerful figure chained down by Rubens. Now, the story of Samson comes to us from the book of Judges 16, where Samson is seduced by Delilah, who is paid by the Philistines to discover the source of Samson's strength, to enslave him. They pay her 100 shekels of silver, but Samson continuously lies to her to put off where the source of his strength actually is derived from. So we find that first he claims that tying 7 bowstrings in his hair would do it. Second, that he instead must be tied with new ropes. Third, that his hair need to be braided into a loom. And after they try all of this, and after she continually nags, the book tells us, he finally tells her that it's his hair, it must be cut. And so we find Delilah brings in the Philistines to cut his hair and then arrest him, blinding him and chaining him. So this is emulatio, for we are not showing the same scene as Rubens' Prometheus Bound, but we certainly are meant to compare the two, where we have a figure who is in agony on his back, lifting his right leg, squirming away from something that's causing him physical pain and distress. A chain is wrapped around one of his arms, but we have a different variety and type of musculature here. Instead of the Flemish approach to classical statuary that heroizes the musculature and the hypertrophied figure of the Titan Prometheus, the Dutch version is much more naturalistic. For an actual strong man, as you would have them at the time, demonstrating the strength of lifting something, for instance, that no one else could, the figure is much more like our power weightlifters today, in which we have a very large abdomen and then very broad chest, to where he looks out of shape at first, but in fact this is what he would more effectively look like, thus comparing the classical approach to the more naturalistic approach of the Dutch. Now, more commonly, the scene shown is going to be Samson asleep, emphasizing the seduction of Delilah. Hence, they have already been involved erotically, and he is spent. So we find that at this point, you generally show people cutting his hair while the Philistines are waiting in the background. So this is post-Freudian castration anxiety, where we find that a man losing his hair and his power and his eyesight relates to impotence or losing one's power in general in society. So here we are forced to confront the gory consequences of his actions, revealing what he was sworn not to, which is the source of his strength fighting for God. So here, just like with Caravaggio's Judith beheading Holofernes, we see the moment that the bloody and gory event is actually transpiring, not leading up to it, not after it, but during, as he is held down, as the knife is plunged into his eye and the associated liquids squirt out of his ocular cavity. As he cringes, they grab his beard, they tie him down, threaten him with spears. All of these are going to be the moment of this great wave pressing down upon him as they bind him and blind him. Much like what we talked about earlier with Guercino and his Samson captured by the Philistines, where the sheer weight of all of these figures in a dramatically lit interior space is going to showcase how he is weakened now without his hair. Turning to self-portraiture, Rembrandt would actually produce 75 self-portraits, which is more than any artist in the century. He gives them often as gifts to potential clients like King Charles I or Cosimo II de' Medici. Now, he never portrays himself like his other fellow artists, who prefer to show themselves, like Rubens here, as perfect gentlemen, with one glove on and one off, wearing a lace collar, and of course wearing a sword, showcasing all of the most common status symbols that we have during the day. So oftentimes, in fact, he would wear theatrical costumes that he had at home, turbans and helmets, or historical figures with portrait historiae or invenzione, just imaginatively in reinventing himself or setting himself in the guise of and the costume of a famous historical or biblical figure. So what is interesting as well is he shows himself aging. So he accepts the human condition, which allows us further insight or psychological acumen, which it looks more as though we can engage with and understand the figures that he paints, especially his self-portraits, giving us great insight into what he's feeling at different stages of his life. So here we have one of his early famous portraits, his self-portrait at the age of 34 at 1640. And in it, we can see that he adopts the same interest in monochromatic palettes, textural differentiation, very carefully showing us the difference between his shirt and the fur-lined coat versus the stone he leans on and his flesh and hair. And then, of course, psychological insight. He turns to us. He is open. He is not confrontational or does not look down at us. So we find that we continue the same traits that he learned early on in his career, beginning to differentiate himself from Peter Lastmann. So looking at them, we see him turning out. We see the imperfections and blemishes. We see the crow's feet under his eyes, the bags, the wrinkles on his forehead, his unkempt mustache. All of these particularities are going to give us a sense of actually being in the presence of someone who is engaged with us, looking out at us, ready to share with us. So this psychological insight will be one of the most talked about aspects of Rembrandt's portraiture. Now, where did he get the pose, and what are we supposed to be reminded of when looking at this particular painting? And, in fact, it's going to be a self-portrait by Titian, the great Venetian artist, and a portrait by Raphael, specifically his Baldassare Castiglione, both of which were in Amsterdam at the time, and Rembrandt would have seen them. And we, of course, are supposed to compare his to them. In one, we have Titian, who has his arm out at a foreshortened angle to the picture plane, leaning on a ledge, looking over his shoulder. In the other, we have a monochromatic approach with a white shirt and then a black coat, and then once again fur around that, with Raphael's portrait of Castiglione. So here we're bringing together the disegno, or the design, the careful outline and linearity of Raphael, which is monochromatic, with the colore of Titian in the pose. Therefore, we have a new term that moves beyond imitatio and emulatio to contaminatio, which is described as the seamless melding of the motifs and formal characteristics of several examples. So instead of Rembrandt emulating one painting by Rubens, such as the Prometheus Bound, and changing the character to another, in these examples with contaminatio, you're going to be looking at several different paintings, for instance, and then merging them into one new one. So we have a wonderful eclectic approach that goes along with this emulation. So this is meant for connoisseurs to compare and then to note where the sources come from. Obviously, the arm over a ledge would immediately point to Titian, who popularized this at the turn of the 16th century, that being 100 years prior. And so the arm is a wonderful trompe-l'oeil, which the ledge is going to demonstrate where, or demarcate where, the picture plane is going to begin and end. So the arm comes out at us, engaging us physically. Now, turning to couples portraits, we have Cornelius van Anslo and his wife from 1641. In this example of a Mennonite preacher who's chosen for his eloquence in interpreting the Bible, we have one of the examples of couples interacting and the ideal type of couple and or marriage, if you will. So with his eloquence here, we have the Bible opened on this table with this tapestry pushed up, quite common for those that are going to be working on the table, with a light illuminating the Bible and the faces of those that are listening. We find that he lectures to his wife, who is absorbed in his words. And from this low vantage point or viewpoint, we are seeing them as though from a pulpit, as though he is preaching in church. You can see that his wife does not look at him, but instead is pondering what he is saying, looking off to the left. So the light, as mentioned, is going to represent truth, for it falls more obviously on the open book and the faces as he speaks. So the truth of the Word of God is illuminating these figures and their souls, pointing the way to salvation. So this is an ideal marriage, but a very different mood given the formality of a preacher than, say, Frans Hals, Isaac Massa, and Beatrix van der Leen, whereby you have a more informal, relaxed, mercantile couple, whereas these are going to be leaders of a religious community, and so therefore are more restricted to how they can be shown. But they are engaging, thus making this a Baroque portrait. We see several examples through Rembrandt's oeuvre, like his Jan Riksen and his wife Geert Jans, where she comes in through the door of his office, giving him a note, and he turns from what he is doing. Thus they are engaging and doing something. So Baroque portraits, by definition, will be active and shown as part of a narrative. Turning to Rembrandt's most famous work, we have the Company of Captain Frans Banning Kock, otherwise known as the Night Watch of 1642, which has been cut down and in fact is not at night, but has darkened over the centuries with varnish. In the work, we have the Civic Guard for Amsterdam, led by Frans Banning Kock in the center, who are assembling outside of the front gates of Amsterdam, preparing a military exercise, as they are all preparing to assemble. They are loading their muskets. They are once again grabbing flags. You find that the drummer is pounding out instructions of what should be done. Now this is going to be so famous that it is recreated in a tableau vivant where people dress up like these characters every January 30th to celebrate the 1648 Independence Day of the Netherlands. Now, Captain Frans Banning Kock and his lieutenant to the right here, our right, shown wearing yellow and holding a spear just like the hand of Banning Kock that comes out at us foreshortened towards the picture plane, is going to be, along with 16 other members, shown doing something. So he is spouting out orders to his lieutenant, who in turn will gather the troops. Now, this is a unified composition originally intended for the great room in the town hall at Amsterdam. It was cut down to fit, once again, a particular frame above a fireplace, and so therefore we do not see the figures off to the sides. And it is a little different than Frans Hals' same subject in a group portrait with the Haarlem Militia Company of St. George, for it is less formal and more entertaining and livelier, we would say. We have more figures in this massive multifigural composition, engaged in a myriad of activities with dramatic lighting. The composition itself is based around diagonals and counter-diagonals that can be traced from the flags that are going to be held, the spears that are going to transect the painting. So we do have a vertical axis and the captain anchoring the composition in the center, along with the horizontal axis anchoring the composition horizontally. But the rest of the diagonals continually moves the eye about, showing us that this is in flux, that we are assembling. They have not assembled yet. Now, the mascot of this particular unit was the hen. So the company's emblem is that of a chicken leg, which is a pun on the leader's name, Kock. So we have this mascot back here of this glowing little woman with a dead chicken on her belt, thus showing us the mascot for this group that are assembling and preparing for this exercise. They will never be attacked by the Spanish, and so these are all merely formal exercises that have no particular military purpose. Now, in 1642, Rembrandt's wife Saskia dies, leaving their son Titus with Rembrandt. However, she does leave a substantial dowry along with her son, with a will that was made 10 days before her death. So interestingly enough, she leaves her vast dowry to her son, her inheritance, not to Rembrandt. Now, what this ensures is that Rembrandt has to take care of their son and cannot merely remarry and disown him. So a very shrewd and smart approach by this practical woman. Now, 2 years later in 1644, Rembrandt is caught up in a very public affair with Geertke Dix, who is the nursemaid for Titus. So he promptly gets rid of her, depriving her of all financial support and her freedom, and she is going to die penniless and in the streets. Now, of course, Rembrandt does face his own setbacks and faces the results of his decisions because he is going to spend lavishly. He has one of the largest townhomes in all of Amsterdam, and he buys exotic wares from Middle Eastern attire to weapons to turbans, a vast menagerie he has in his attic. So this catches up to him, and he declares bankruptcy in 1656 like Frans Hals and has to sell off his works. From this period, we have a more somber, introspective approach that relates to psychobiography, that we're looking at how this relates to his life. So from the 1640s and 50s, we have a tectonic or classical approach more akin to Poussin. Moving into the 1660s, however, we have the 6-foot-wide Peter denying Christ, which is commissioned to go above a fireplace and mantle. We have the later style of, once again, Rembrandt, with this warm, glowing, loosely painted approach. In this example, we have Peter denying that he is an apostle of Christ 3 times, and then the cock crows. So here we have the same subject painted by others, say Utrecht Caravaggio, like Van Honthorst here. We find that the light is in the center now, and St. Peter receives all of the light. For the light is going to be the equivalent of truth in Rembrandt, as we just discussed with the Mennonite preacher. For Peter turns away from the truth, which is that he is an apostle of Christ, and we should not deny Christ. In the background, we see Christ led away in chains, looking back at Peter and his denial. So the style later on is going to be one that is more empathetic, that is more related to pathos, and where we see less figures. They are larger, loosely painted, focusing on these subtle, nuanced interpretations, like his Lucrezia of 1666, which is the suicide of a virtuous woman in ancient Rome after she is raped by Sextus Tarquinius, the son of the Roman king Tarquinius Superbus, while her husband is at war. Here she pulls the bell to the cord, which rings to summon her husband and her father to explain her decision to commit suicide, having just thrust this knife into her chest. She does not want to live in shame. Now, her death will be avenged by her brother and husband, who go and kill the Tarquins, thus ending the Etruscan rule of kings and establishing the Roman Republic, which Dutch humanists are going to see as an allegory of the founding of the Dutch Republic itself after they defeated the Spanish. So in this story, in which you have people taking something that does not belong to them, the Tarquins, who rape Lucrezia, we find that the Dutch see the Spanish in the same light, and they are expelled, and they found this new republic in the north after their expulsion. So the story here is actually an exempla, or an example of virtue, of chastity specifically. For in earlier versions, such as the workshop of Botticelli, we have Lucrezia sacrificing her life to safeguard her husband's honor. Off to the side, we have the rapist Tarquin threatening her. And then she collapses into the arms of her husband and her father, having committed suicide. In the center, we have the body of Lucrezia with the knife sticking out of her chest, which incites revenge by the Romans against the Tarquins, thus giving rise to the Roman Empire. The way in which this was shown in the past, however, is very interesting and telling, for it was presented as a sexy suicide, usually showing before the actual act has occurred or after threatening suicide, for instance. We do not show her actually plunging the dagger into her chest and considering the emotional consequences of what has been done to her, of this particular assault. So here are just some examples, much like Cleopatra with the asp. We have another example of a sexy suicide. Instead, here we are forced to confront the psychological reality of a woman who was sexually assaulted and the human intimacy and empathy that we have with her, understanding why she has made the decision that she has done here that will unify and solidify these people. Now, how is this like Rembrandt's life? Well, in 1654, Hendrike, that being Rembrandt's new lover, is accused of adultery by the Reformed Church in Amsterdam after it is found out that she is pregnant by Rembrandt. She is then banned from all church services, and we know that he could not marry Hendrike, thus making her an honest woman, because he would lose the dowry of Saskia's estate, because she left it to Titus, and he had to wait until he came of age. So he cannot, once again, do right, as we would say, by this new lover. So Lucrezia is seen here, arguably by Rembrandt, as blameless and innocent as Hendrike, who didn't do anything to deserve this type of ostracizing in the community. So we know that Rembrandt and Titus are going to succumb to the plague in 1669, leaving Hendrike with their daughter alone and largely penniless. Next time, we will continue on by looking at Vermeer and Ruysdael, and especially genre scenes in the north and landscapes, which will be the most popular category of painting.